Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Branden. You're listening to episode 128, In the Dead of Night. In the pantheon of true crime books, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was not a shift in the genre, but the shift. Embedded and rigorously well-researched, Capote wrote beautiful prose that captured the grotesquerie of mass murder and its consequences. As a result, the reader is both horrified and entertained. It's as if the omniscient narrator, Truman Capote, lifts a mirror to his reader and says, here's the full gamut of human emotions and ultimately the human condition, and where do you stand in that? Here's Truman Capote.
The subject matter of my book was purely incidental. I mean, it's the least interesting or important thing about the book. The interest of the book is in how it sets out to explore what I consider an unexplored literary medium and what one does with it. And it just happens quite incidentally to be that I chose a crime. I don't even know that I chose it. It was somehow, so to say, thrust upon me by fate.
In today's episode, we delve into the horrifying murders detailed in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. A horrific crime that occurred in the most unlikely of places and in time. Holcomb, Kansas, November 1959. But let's start with Herb Clutter. Through back-breaking hard work, over the years, he'd become a successful farmer. He owned more than 800 acres of farmland, a fertile spread he christened the River Valley Farm. Mr. Clutter grew wheat and other crops. He also raised sheep and cattle, and in many ways, he was like the golden wheat that he grew, a valued staple in his community and beyond. He was so well respected that he'd been selected by President Eisenhower to serve on the Federal Farm Credit Board. Clutter's farm was a half-mile away from the small town of Holcomb, which was made up of less than 300 people. The community may have been small, but they were mighty, a very tight-knit group of people, and the church was the epicenter of life, as was family and giving back. The Clutter family represented the best of what the area had to offer. God-fearing folks who treated people with respect and generosity because they believed it was the right thing to do, not because they were worried that their neighbors or God was watching. At 49 years of age, Mr. Clutter was steadfast against alcohol, cigarettes, and caffeine. He believed in clean living, and it showed. He was the same weight as he'd been in college. He was strong and healthy. He was also totally devoted to his wife and their 4 children. 23-year-old Eve Anna was married and lived in Nebraska. 21-year-old Beverly attended nursing school. The Clutters lived on the farm with their 2 younger children, 16-year-old Nancy and 15-year-old Kenyon, the Clutters' only son. Their homestead was the pride of the town. Herb was a man of the future. The family didn't live in a farmhouse, but a meticulously designed modern mid-century gem. And when it came to farming, Herb was all about the future. Here's Mr. Clutter in an interview describing his combine, a heavy-duty machine he used to reap wheat.
This is only a part of the machinery needed to operate an ordinary-sized farm, and in order to make these farms economical, you certainly have to have a farm big enough in order to use this machinery efficiently and pay for the investment that you have.
And Mr. Clutter made sure that his farm ran like a well-oiled machine, and Saturday, November 14th, was no exception. That day, the only significant thing out of the ordinary was that Mr. Clutter had finally signed a life insurance policy he'd been ruminating over for months. His agent had come out to the farm to pick up a check and the signed contract. The policy he chose would pay out $40,000 in life insurance to his family, with a double indemnity in the event of an accident. That evening, Mrs. Clutter went to bed early, but after dinner, Mr. Clutter, Kenyon, Nancy, and her boyfriend, Bobby, spent the evening watching TV together. At around 10:30, Bobby left for home. And then the family went to bed. They didn't lock their doors that night. They never did. Why would they? In Holcomb, Kansas, they were safe. What did the Clutters have to fear? The following morning, something odd was brewing. It was a Sunday, and the Clutters weren't answering the door. Nancy's classmate, whose name was also Nancy, arrived at the Clutters' house that morning like clockwork. Every Sunday morning, Nancy's father dropped her off at the Clutters' home, and then she caught a ride with them to church. But it was around 9 a.m., and nobody was answering the door. Concerned, the classmate and her father decided to drive to Susan's home, Nancy's best friend, who was also waiting to be picked up by the Clutters. That morning, Susan called the Clutter residence, but no one picked up. Susan's mother suggested that maybe the Clutters had overslept, which didn't seem right. They weren't the type to be late for anything, especially church. So Susan, Nancy, and her father decided to drive back to the Clutter farm to wake them up. As Nancy's father turned into the Clutters' long driveway for the second time that morning, the trees that dotted both sides of the lane took on a more sinister effect. It was November, and most had lost their leaves, exposing a network of ugly, gnarled branches. By then, Mr. Clutter's lush and golden wheat fields had been diminished too, methodically plowed to studs by his combine, and the melancholic, expansive gray sky was filled with muted puffs of ugly conjoined clouds that blotted out the sun. Still, Nancy and Susan went up to the door and rang the bell. There was no answer. At the back of the house, they knocked, tentative, but then hard and harder. But the pounding was met with more silence, which was strange because the family's cars were all still parked in the garage. The door was unlocked, so the teenagers pushed it open. Immediately they called out for Nancy, and they noticed that her purse was lying on the floor next to the back door. Undeterred, the girls headed for the stairs and up to Nancy's room. Susan got there first and immediately screamed and then ran out of the room and down the stairs. But Nancy continued on. When she got close, she tried to shake Nancy awake, that is, until she noticed blood splattered all over the wall, and like Susan, fled in terror. Nancy's dad mustered the courage to go inside the Clutter home. He looked for the phone in the kitchen to call an ambulance. That's when he noticed that the cord had been cut. Obviously, something was radically wrong at the Clutter house. But it was so much worse than he or anyone could ever fathom. The entire family, Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, had been murdered. When local sheriff Earl Robinson arrived at the scene, he went through the house and quickly determined his office was not equipped to handle a quadruple homicide.
Is there any sign of a struggle in the house?
None that we could see.
And have you called in any extra state help to help you in this investigation?
Yes, we have. We have the Highway Patrol and Kansas KBI.
Do you have any leads at the present time on who might have committed this quadruple murder?
We have no leads whatever.
Alvin Dewey from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation was at church that Sunday morning when investigators searched for him amongst the pews and told him he was needed at the Clutter residence. Dewey was assigned to lead the investigation. Here he is summarizing the grisly crime scene.
The scene at the Clutter home was not a pretty sight. Mr. Clutter was found in the furnace room, bound and gagged, shot in the head with a 12-gauge shotgun, and his throat cut. Their only son, Kenyon, was in another room in the basement, tied to the couch, bound and gagged, and shot in the head with a shotgun. In the upstairs, the mother, Bonnie Clutter, was found in her room, bound and gagged, and shot in the side of the head with a shotgun. Nancy, the 16-year-old girl, was found in bed, bound, and shot in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun.
The medical examiner determined the murders occurred sometime between 11 p.m. Friday night and 2 a.m. Saturday morning. The victims had been killed in different rooms. Right away, investigators keyed into a few things. Whoever did this had the ability to expertly manage the victims despite Herb and Kenyon, who were both strong and in good shape. Another thing, the knots binding the victims were uniquely tied. That morning, they also noted that nothing appeared to have been rifled through, just a couple items out of place. Mr. Clutter's wallet was found flapped open, and Nancy's purse was on the floor near the back door. But no suspect fingerprints were found, and the shell casings from the shotgun blasts had been collected. The glaring question became, what was the motive? Based on the brutality of the crimes and the lack of evidence, investigators were forced to theorize two possibilities. A lone killer exacting revenge against Mr. Clutter. Remember, he was not only shot but also had his throat cut. Was Herb's family collateral damage? Near Mr. Clutter's body, they found a bloody boot print.
We took photographs of every room in the house and, of course, of the victims. We searched for latent fingerprints, and there was a footprint that was made on the floor in the basement by an individual who had stepped in some blood of Mr. Clutter. The laboratory could tell us the name of the half-sole on this boot, which was a cat paw half-sole.
Was the motive for murder as old as time? Jealousy. A love triangle gone horribly wrong. Despite Mr. Clutter's appearance of total devotion to his wife, investigators learned that the couple did sleep in separate rooms. Apparently, Mrs. Clutter had been dealing with health issues. Had the deeply religious family man stepped out on his wife, and as a result, he and his family were murdered? And what about Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby? Remember, he was the last one to see the family alive.
We had to take into consideration the position of Nancy Clutter's body. She had been shot in the back of the head. We had to think about the boyfriend, someone that could shoot the other members of the family, looking them in the face, but couldn't do it to Nancy.
But pretty quickly, he was cleared after he passed a polygraph. There was also that life insurance policy Mr. Clutter had signed literally 8 hours before his murder. The eldest daughters were now the sole heirs of a policy worth more than $850,000 in today's money.
On the afternoon prior to the murder, Mr. Clutter took out $40,000 worth of life insurance, double indemnity, and as a result, his two remaining daughters are $40,000 richer today than they would have been.
But the daughters were also quickly ruled out because they had solid alibis.
But in our investigation, we found that this insurance deal had been in the brewing, so to speak, for several months.
Investigators looked into anyone that could possibly have a grudge against the Clutter family, and nothing panned out. Authorities would catch a break in the form of a crime scene photo. With the naked eye, you couldn't see, but after the photos had been developed, a second boot print had made a very faint impression in a layer of dust on that cardboard that Mr. Clutter had been found lying on, which meant a second killer.
When we developed the photographs, we were able to see a boot print made in the dust that one could not observe with the naked eye.
So the motive didn't appear to be a robbery, because it was widely known that Mr. Clutter never kept cash around. He paid for everything by check, and yet his wallet was found open, and there was Nancy's purse on the floor. Investigators found out that Mr. Clutter had cashed a check for $60 on Saturday. Based on his spending that day, they were able to calculate that he possibly had at least $50 left. Would someone kill 4 people for $50? Meanwhile, in the days following the murders, paranoia seeped into the hearts and minds of the community. The Clutters were so admired, secure, a representation of everything good about the community. If they were murdered in cold blood, what chance did anyone else have? Their murders in the dead of night struck fear and depression within the community. The rumor mill was on fire, and word on the street was that the killer walked amongst them. But who? And why? This fear metastasized further after Arthur Clutter, Herb's brother, was quoted by a journalist just 2 days after the murder saying, quote, "When this is cleared up, I'll wager whoever did it was someone within 10 miles of where we now stand." The hunt for the killers became more complicated after a newspaper offered a $1,000 reward for information that would lead to an arrest and conviction. Suddenly, the tip line was flooded with useless calls that took up time and energy. People in the community calling in about their concerns related to neighbors and relatives, suspicious activity, people acting weird, strange coincidences that suddenly seemed sinister. But a few other clues trickled in from more reliable sources. Like the Clutter's housekeeper. She had noticed that Kenyon's gray portable Zenith radio was missing, and so were Mr. Clutter's binoculars.
We find that murder is usually committed for a definite cause. That is, during a robbery, a rape, or because of a grudge. The only thing missing from the Clutter home was a little portable radio and a pair of binoculars.
The burglary theory was further bolstered after a family member recovered Nancy's gold watch secreted into the toe of her shoe. Had she quickly shoved it in there for safekeeping as she was being held hostage in a burglary that would go terribly wrong? And there were other, more subtle clues to ponder, little tidbits that hinted at least one of the killers, despite the brutality of the crime, did they have a warped sense of conscience? Why else was Mr. Clutter's body found on top of a mattress box? Other than, in a twisted kind of way, one of the killers was trying to provide a bit of comfort against the cold cement floor. A pillow placed under Kenyon's head as he was tied to a couch, and would ultimately have a shotgun pointed directly in his face as one of the killers pulled the trigger. And covers were pulled up as Nancy and Bonnie lay in their beds, tied up beneath the blankets, as if they were tucked in before being shot to death. What did it all mean? That's what investigators were trying to figure out. And manage the local media. Because the murder of a wealthy farmer and his family in the small town of Holcomb was not just front page news locally, but beyond. The New York Times devoted 300 words to the slayings, an article that would ultimately capture the attention of celebrated author and journalist Truman Capote.
One day I was just thumbing through the New York Times, and way in the back part of the New York Times I saw this small item, prominent wheat grower slain. It was only 2 or 3 paragraphs long. And I didn't really think anything about it at the moment at all, but somehow it triggered the idea in my mind, a crime, maybe a crime, if one followed a crime from beginning to end. Right? That might make a suitable framework in order to do this literary experiment that I wanted to do. And there was something about the very ordinariness of the crime that appealed to me, because the very lack of anything exotic or strange about it. I mean, I wanted it to be something that wouldn't be too outre or in itself. So I suddenly decided, well, why don't I go there? Why don't I go to this stuff? So I went.
2 days after the funeral, Capote was in Holcomb covering the story.
I went to see the detective who was in charge of the case, Mr. Dewey, who became such a great friend of mine. Well, he was very unfriendly when I was first there. And he asked me for some identification, and the only thing I had was a passport. I didn't even have a credit card. And I lived in this little hotel there, and everybody, there were lots and lots of reporters there, but all sort of, I'm from Midwest, from Chicago and Denver and Kansas City. I mean, the case didn't attract any attention west of Denver or east of Chicago, but it had great interest out there. So at first, I wasn't too noticeable. But then finally, all the reporters went away, and I was the only one left. And then people began to wonder, well, who is that strange little guy? And everywhere I'd go to get an interview, sometimes I would go and knock on the door, and the people would come and open the door just about like this. And before I could say one word, they would slam the door shut and run and call the sheriff's office. Because the moment I'd say Clutter, they thought perhaps I was the murderer in person,
Dad, why don't you drive a nice car? My husband was a teen when he asked his father this cringeworthy question. Because at the time, his father was a celebrated professor of psychology, which means they both knew this wasn't a question, but a commentary. He was embarrassed because he didn't drive a slick new car like the other dads. His father chose instead to prioritize his children. My husband feels guilty about it now, but he also understands because his kids could literally ask him the same question, and the answer would also be the same. But my husband doesn't want to repeat history. He wants our kids to learn the value of money at a young age, how hard it is to earn, and even harder, how to save. We both do. And since April is Financial Literacy Month, the timing is perfect to start teaching your kids about how to earn and save money. And Acorns Early makes it super easy with their Smart Money app and debit cards for kids. The Acorns Early app has a chores tracker, which teaches kids that hard work pays off. Just set up tasks in the app, set a payment amount, and tick the chore off when it's done. And my kids love having their very own debit cards. It's fun for me to watch them pull it out, slide it into the credit card machine at the store, and enter their PIN, engage with the customer service rep, who at the end of the exchange hands them their purchase. I can see it in their eyes. They feel so grown up. But the deeper reason I love Acorns Early is because it's just an amazing tool that, let's face it, no disrespect, but my father-in-law didn't have access to. And because he was working so hard, he didn't have the time to sit down with his son and set up chores, encourage his financial goals, and praise him for meeting and exceeding his own expectations. So, are you ready to help your kids grow money skills that will last a lifetime? Just head to acornsearly.com or download the Acorns Early app to get started. Sign up now, and your first month is on us. Acorns Early Card is issued by Community Federal Savings Bank, member FDIC, pursuant to license by MasterCard International. TNCs apply. Monthly subscription fee starting from $5 per month unless canceled. Capote went on a whim. He had no idea if the case would ultimately go cold because at the time of his arrival in Holcomb, it didn't feel like the investigation was anywhere close to narrowing in on the killers. They couldn't even say for certain what the motive of the murders was. But there was one man who did know the motive and who was responsible. Floyd Wells was serving 3 to 5 years for burglary at Kansas State Penitentiary. 2 days after the murders, he heard a news report on the radio that said, quote, "Officers investigating the tragic slaying of 4 members of the Herbert W. Clutter family have appealed to the public for any information which might aid in solving this baffling crime." Clutter, his wife, and their 2 children were found murdered in their farm home near Garden City early Sunday morning. Each had been bound, gagged, and shot through the head with a 12-gauge shotgun. Immediately, Floyd was frightened because of a conversation he had with a former cellmate, a guy named Dick, who had been serving time for writing bad checks. Floyd had been swapping stories about life with Dick, and it was then that he shared 10 years ago he'd worked for a successful farmer in Holcomb named Herb Clutter. Dick was immediately interested and began asking a bunch of questions, like, did Clutter have a lot of money? Floyd said he did, that he usually kept around $10,000 in his safe at home. Dick ruminated and continued asking questions, like, where was the farm? What was the layout of the house? Who lived there? Eventually, he confided to Floyd that when he got out of prison, he was going to rob the safe with his friend Perry, who he'd also shared a cell with, and that they were going to get away with it because they would kill any witnesses at the Clutter farm. Floyd wouldn't go to the authorities until after the reward was offered. That's when he told the warden about Dick and Perry's plans. This information was passed along to investigators. According to the arrest records of Richard Eugene Hickok, or Dick, and his buddy Perry Edward Smith, they were petty thieves, not mass murderers. Dick was 28 years old, and his mugshot details described him as blonde hair, blue-eyed, 5'10", and 175 pounds. Perry was 31 and described as brown hair and brown eyes, 5'4", and 156 pounds. Perry and Dick had both been paroled the summer before the murders. An investigator went to the home of Dick's parents, who lived about 400 miles away from Holcomb. They learned Dick had been hanging around Perry, but neither of them had been seen since November 21st, 6 days after the murders. The family had no idea where they went. Investigators didn't say anything about the Clutter murders to Dick's parents. They told them that they came looking for Dick because of a slew of bad checks that he'd written before he skipped town. To that end, they casually asked what Dick had been up to before he left, around the 14th and 15th. As a matter of fact, they did. Dick told his parents that he was going on an overnight road trip to Fort Scott. Apparently, Perry needed to go there to pick up some money his sister owed him. The pair left at around 12 p.m. that Saturday, and Dick was back at his parents' home by noon the following Sunday. Not only did they have time to commit the murders within those 24 hours, but Perry's sister didn't even live in Fort Scott, Kansas. She was in California and hadn't spoken to her brother in years. And when investigators asked Dick's parents about the 12-gauge shotgun that was propped up against the wall in their living room, they told them it belonged to Dick. An all-points bulletin was launched in 17 states from Arkansas to Oregon. The notice stated that law enforcement should be on the lookout for Dick and Perry for parole violations, not murder. They didn't want to tip off the media or their suspects. If the two heard a news report that they were suspects in a quadruple homicide, odds were pretty good that they would go further underground. The odds were pretty small, but if they were the killers, maybe they were still wearing those boots. They wouldn't know about the boot that had a cat paw print, which had been found smeared in Clutter's blood. And the other boot print was a unique diamond pattern. Remember, a faint print had been left in the dust on that piece of cardboard. 6 weeks after the murders, Dick and Perry were spotted in Las Vegas. They were arrested and taken into custody. Since November 21st, they'd traveled thousands of miles together, which included a trip to Mexico, where they'd hoped to start a new life. But after they'd blown through the money that Dick had gotten from passing bad checks, they came back to the United States. However, it was fortuitous, because just before they were arrested, Perry went to the post office to collect a box he'd shipped to himself from Mexico that contained, among other things, 2 pairs of boots. One that belonged to him, that matched the cat's paw design found at the crime scene. The other was Dick's, that matched the unique diamond pattern found in the dust on the cardboard. When Dick was told they had a witness, he was the first to break. He sobbed out a confession, blaming the murders on Perry, who he claimed had just flipped out and without warning slashed Mr. Clutter's throat and then shot him in the head. That it was Perry who had murdered the entire family. When Perry was told that Dick had confessed and placed all the blame on him, well, it wasn't long before Perry was singing too. But he said that it was true he had shot Mr. Clutter and Kenyon, but that Dick had been the one to shoot Bonnie and Nancy. Later, Perry would recant one thing. He admitted that it was true, that he had been the one to shoot every member of the Clutter family. This is what they claimed happened that night. The Clutter home was unlocked, and they just walked in. The family was asleep. They first went to Mr. Clutter's office, looking for that safe. When they couldn't find it, they went and woke him up. Under the threat of a shotgun in his face, they demanded money. When he calmly told the intruders he didn't have a safe and didn't carry cash, they forced him upstairs to wake up his family. The men would bind and gag Bonnie and Nancy. Both women were then tucked into their beds. Herb and Kenyon were brought to separate rooms in the basement. Kenyon was tied to a couch in a playroom. Herb was taken to the unfinished furnace room, where he was told to lay down on the cardboard mattress box in front of the furnace. Afterward, Perry stayed with Clutter while Dick went upstairs to look for a non-existent safe. After a while, Dick returned to the furnace room, where Perry was standing guard over Mr. Clutter. At that point, both men accepted that there was no safe and no money to be had in the house. They looked at each other. They knew that they had already come prepared to kill any witnesses. But according to Dick, that's when Perry reached down and cut Mr. Clutter's throat. After that, he grabbed Dick's gun and shot him in the head. Then both men went to the room next door, and Perry shot Kenyon. Again, both men together went upstairs into Nancy's room and shot her. And together they went into Bonnie's room, and Perry shot her too. According to Perry, he was the one who placed the pillow under Kenyon's head, laid the cardboard down, and it was he who had tucked in mother and daughter, and he was the one who stopped Dick from sexually assaulting Nancy that night. Dick and Perry would be extradited from Las Vegas to Kansas to await trial. Separated in the local jail, Perry writes his thoughts down daily. According to the book In Cold Blood, Perry writes about the person he misses most. Quote, "Many thoughts of Dick," he wrote in his makeshift diary. Since their arrest, they had not been allowed to communicate, and that, freedom aside, was what he most desired, to talk to Dick. Be with Dick again. Dick was not the hard rock he'd once thought him. Pragmatic, virile, a real brass boy. He'd proven himself to be pretty weak and shallow, a coward. Still, of everyone in all the world, this was the person to whom he was the closest at the moment. For they at least were of the same species, brothers in the breed of Cain. Separated from him, Perry felt, all by myself, like somebody covered with sores, somebody only a big nut would have anything to do with. The thing about Perry is that he'd always dreamed of fulfilling a lifelong goal of being an adventurer in Mexico, which is why he agreed to Dick's scheme to rob the Clutters and then kill them all. That this would fund his dream of he and Dick being gold prospectors or deep-sea divers, searching the ocean for sunken treasure. Dick and Perry's relationship had been forged in that cell that they shared. Perry so desperately wanted to impress Dick that he lied and said he'd murdered a man just for fun. Perry was extremely self-conscious about his physique. His legs had been mangled in a motorcycle accident, and as a result, they were now withered, and he walked with a limp. Already short in stature, he was always trying to prove his masculinity to Dick. He yearned for his friendship and respect. Perry knew saying he'd murdered someone for fun would guarantee both. But there is something that both men had in common. When they were released from prison, they were embittered, angry men who believed they deserved a better life. But unlike Mr. Clutter, they didn't want to work for it and were disgusted by his pious, well-respected life. They envied his wealth and success and his stature in the community. Qualities neither of them imbued. This fact infuriated them. Now, sitting in jail, awaiting trial, both men concocted escape plans. Dick secretly worked on sharpening a toilet cleaning brush into a shiv he planned to stick into any man who opened his cell. Then he would flee to the wilderness in Colorado and live off the land. But this plan was short-lived because his cell was searched and the weapons seized. Perry's escape was far more fantastical. He had convinced himself that when he looked out of the window of his jail cell, he saw 2 young men in the courtyard, and they were smiling at him. He interpreted this as a signal that they wanted to help him break out of jail. He convinced himself that they were doing this so that in turn he would take them on an adventure of a lifetime. Perry was so excited he drew a schematic of the jail on a piece of paper, marking the best spots to park the getaway car. And underneath the map, he wrote a message to the young men. Quote, "I need a hacksaw blade 5 inches, nothing else. But do you realize the consequences if you get caught? Nod your head if you do. It could mean a long stretch in prison, or you might get killed, all for someone you don't know. You better think it over. Seriously. Besides, how do I know I can trust you? How do I know it isn't a trick to get me out there and gun me down? What about Hickok? All preparations must include him." End quote. Perry waited anxiously for the young men to return to the courtyard and await further instructions. He had crumpled up the map into a ball, which he planned to drop out of the window, but the men never came back. Dick and Perry's trial began in March of 1960. Based on the evidence and their confessions, the best they could hope for was to be spared a death sentence. However, the jury wasn't prepared to give what hadn't been afforded to the Clutters: mercy. Both men were sentenced to death by hanging. In April of 1965, Dick Hickok was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. Perry Smith followed afterward and was pronounced dead at 1:19 a.m. In the end, Dick and Perry would be buried in graves next to each other. The book, In Cold Blood, was published after their deaths in 1966. It would spend 37 weeks on the New York Times best-selling list and would go on to become the second best-selling true crime book in history. Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, which was written in 1974 about the Charles Manson murders, was number 1. And there's no doubt that In Cold Blood transformed the genre of true crime. However, after 6 years of meticulous investigation, interviewing townspeople, investigators, family members, and the killers themselves, all that would take a very heavy emotional toll on Truman Capote.
You said in one interview I read that Dick was very open. You could talk to him very quickly, but it took you much longer to get to know Perry, and yet Perry is eventually more interesting.
Perry is a far more complicated, extraordinary person. I mean, it's a great, strange, warped sensitivity, and but Dick was, happy-go-lucky. Even in absolute extremity, it would go right on to being. The last thing he ever said to me was a joke. Just before I was standing with him in this room, this holding room, before they went out when they hanged him that night, and he was the very last thing he told me was a dirty joke. And this after 5.5 years, and you're going to be hanged in 2 minutes. It was extraordinary how completely consistent he was. Of course, it was all self-defense, if you know what I mean.
Capote would never complete another book and died in August of 1984 at the age of 59. Before I let you go, I want to give a special thanks to Cold Blooded, the Clutter Family Murders documentary, for some of the audio clips used in this episode. And of course, the book In Cold Blood by Truman Capote was a great resource as well. Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Branden Morgan and I will discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Branden Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.